these are my opinions.
These are my opinions. These are my opinions.
So these are my 9 most disappointing reads of 2022. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Leandra, the TBR0, and the goal of this channel is to slowly but surely help me lessen my physical TBR to 0. I have far more books that I own that I haven't read than those that I have, and that's a situation I would like to remedy. Today, my focus will actually be on my top disappointing reads of 2022. It kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but I went through my list of books that I've read thus far throughout the year 2022. At the moment, I think I am on 95 books read, and I'm very happy with that. That is crazy. My goal was 50. I surpassed that and then some. I ended up gathering the titles, and I found about 9 books that were most disappointing to me. Before I get into the list, though, of course, it's important to know that these are my opinions. There was a particular choice made in the fact that I'm saying disappointing reads and not worst reads. I think that when we say worst, we often are seeing some type of ultimatum. This is a superlative word. It blurs the line that exists of opinion versus fact, whereas disappointing, I think, is a far better term to use when it comes to subjective opinions. I may have been disappointed because I personally had high hopes. I personally expected or anticipated different events or different types of characters to be involved in this book. I also may simply be affected emotionally differently from someone else who read the same novel. So I think disappointing is just a better word to use, and that's why I'm using it here. So these are my 9 most disappointing reads of 2022. If you've read any of these books and you absolutely adored them, or you didn't and you agree with me, I would love to hear either of those opinions in the comments, because I really do enjoy discussing books that provide some type of variety in reactions. I love books that are just as well loved as they are well hated. I think that actually the author does such a good job. That means they've done a really good job if they have a variety of opinions. That means we've all been affected viscerally or emotionally in some way. And that's the whole point of writing. So I would really love to hear if any of these are actually your favorites. I would find that really fascinating. Like and subscribe. The first book that is on my disappointing list was actually the first book I read in 2022, and that was the final revival of Opal and Nev. This was by Donnie Walton, and it's a pretty new release. It came out in 2021, and it was one of the last purchases that I made back in 2021 in December because a friend of mine recommended it to me. She really enjoyed it. She found it really fascinating, and she thought I would as well. And while it certainly surprised me in good ways and bad ways, I would say it ultimately was a disappointment, mainly for reasons I hadn't expected. I went in having low expectations at first because this is a novel that focuses on fictionalized artists in the music world. If I remember correctly, it was kind of during the 60s, 70s, 80s. And I just personally have never been interested in that. I've never really been interested in fictionalized famous people, fictionalized entertainers. That is the main reason at first why I chose to really never read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Now that I've seen a few other reviews showing how problematic that title is, I'm very glad not to ever read it. But initially it just didn't interest me because it was some fictionalized actress. I just don't care. I don't even care about it very much when it comes to nonfiction reads unless the person, whether it be a singer, an actor, is no longer in that field when it comes to main income. Only then am I actually interested in reading and learning from them. But when they're super famous and super rich and entertainers still, I just can't see myself ever really connecting with them or understanding their lifestyle. So that is what I was going in to the final revival of Opal and Nev thinking I would hate. But I actually didn't mind the music element. I thought it was really fascinating, and it definitely added certain textures to the story arc that I think benefited it. The one reason why I was actually really disappointed was mainly because the main heroine, she was placed on this pedestal, whereas I was reading her as a gray character. Many of her actions were self-serving at times. They were survival methods sometimes. Other times it was simply her just thinking of herself and her needs and not really thinking of how it would affect other people. And I'm fine with great characters. I actually think that that's more realistic. I love reading books that have great characters. I just prefer it actually, but the narrative voice has to match this tone. And I felt like the narrative voice for this book put her on a pedestal that she didn't deserve and I didn't really like. And so I think that's why it was ultimately disappointing, because I just couldn't drink the Kool-Aid and agree that this main character was only a good guy the entire time, when honestly there were many aspects of the book where I found her to be really selfish, which again, I would have been fine with if it was written the way that it should have been, in my opinion. So yeah, that was disappointing. I ended up giving it just 2 stars. The second book that I found disappointing in 2022 was Headed for a Hearse by Jonathan Latimer. Now this one I read in April, and it was the 26th book that I read this year. Kind of crazy. Probably no one else enjoys these statistics, but I do. And so this book was originally published in 1935, so it would be categorized under the genre of Golden Age detective fiction, particularly American, and even more so hard-boiled, which is a subgenre within detective fiction that I'm not as familiar with. But this year I really wanted to branch out, try new things, and so I was really excited because I got it in my subscription to the Mysterious Bookshop. I get a book every single month through them, and it's an Otto Penzler Presents American Classics edition. And it ended up being really disappointing for me because I think I've just realized from this book that hard-boiled / film noir, both of those film and book genres are very tied together because hard-boiled writing ended up influencing the existence of film noir. Both of them tend to be very racist and prejudiced, as well as sexist, and Headed for a Hearse is no different. And the main reason why I was so disappointed was because of how well written the mystery part of it was. It was really well plotted, it was intricate, it was fascinating. The ending was extremely satisfying in regards to the reveal. However, the amount of racism against race, ethnicity, culture, as well as the amount of sexism. Every single woman in this book was objectified and judged based on how sexually appealing she was or wasn't. I couldn't believe how much focus was on there. I would have probably given this book 5 stars if it wasn't for that. Because at the same time I ended up doing a vlog with Headed for a Hearse alongside reading Craig Rice's book 8 Faces at 3. Both of them were frame-up job mysteries set in Chicago, both written in the 1930s. And Craig Rice is a woman, just to be a bit more transparent about this. And I think that's really key to understanding the differences between those 2 novels, but they were very similar in regards to structural mystery, plot lines. But I gave Craig Rice 5 stars, even though I don't think the ending was nearly as satisfying as with Headed for a Hearse, but I still gave it 5 stars because it was just so well written. Meanwhile, with Headed for the Hearse, there was just so many problems with it that I actually almost DNF'd this book, now that I think about it, that I had to give it a star. So yeah, I was really extremely disappointed, and I'm just so hesitant to read hard-boiled fiction after that experience. I didn't read another one for the rest of the year actually, except for one that was modern, and it was written by an American Black woman, which I think is in itself demonstrates the differences and why I ended up really loving that one compared to these more classic titles. The third book that I'll be talking about for disappointing reads is The Woman in the Library by Sulari Gentile. This was another recently published book. It was a Netgalley ARC, so I had early access to it. It came out in 2022, and it was the 36th book that I read this year in May. And I think, again, my high hopes ended up bringing me into this novel with different expectations. It was a great premise. I loved the metafictional references at first, the idea that there is a novel within a novel. So the first layer is an epistolary type of storyline where we're getting letters from this beta reader to the novelist, and she's writing, this mystery, and between those epistolary sections, we're getting the meat of the story, which is fictional, the characters she's created, and the mystery that they're trying to unravel. And At one point, I ended up getting far more invested in the novel within the novel than I did with the epistolary back and forth. And I was frustrated every time we had to go back into one of these epistolary voices. So I think that there were two great ideas that this author ended up coming up with. And rather than giving them two separate novels that they deserved, she pushed them together. And so it was really jarring, and I didn't really like that aspect as much. So I ended up giving it 2 stars. With that said, I can fully see myself picking up another novel by Gentile because I really did like her writing style, and I was compelled by that one storyline within the 2. So yeah, I would definitely give her a try again. I was also very much disappointed by Arthur Conan Doyle's A Story in Scarlet and The Sign of the Four. This was a book that featured both novellas, and I do blame myself partially for how disappointed I was by it. The former was originally published in 1887 and the latter was published in 1890. So these are 19th century detective fiction stories, very much among the first to ever exist when it comes to British detective fiction. So they're pretty much the blueprints of most mysteries that exist today. And I went in with such high expectations, mainly because one, I really adored The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is a short story collection I read a few years ago by Arthur Conan Doyle. I'm also an avid fan of a few adaptations, for instance, Sherlock, the BBC series version, and Lady Sherlock series, which I've mentioned many times on this channel. So I entered this book very excited to kind of get back into this very classic, traditional 19th century London setting. And there were aspects that I did enjoy. I did like the first half of A Study in Scarlet, the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, but then it completely took me left field when the latter half of that particular story was set during 1800s American Wild West, like lawless America. We had some extremist LDS members, also known as Mormons, in the mix, and it just was so far-fetched and ridiculous, even though I will say I definitely believe in the lawlessness part, but it was just a little bit too much for me to swallow and probably didn't age very well. And then with The Sign of the Four, that one definitely didn't age very well. Oh my goodness, it's just kind of baffling to think about. And I can't imagine any modern day reader saying that's my favorite Sherlock Holmes, because it's just utterly ridiculous. It kind of reminds me of, was it an orangutan reveal for one of Edgar Allan Poe's most famous stories? That kind of absurdity, especially because it was so racist and so prejudiced. The fact that the mystery itself, the reveal, the solution, all of it was very much dependent on certain prejudice, discriminatory expectations about a non-white group of people. Like, that's the only way that this mystery actually could have made sense and occurred, was based on Arthur Conan Doyle's clear racism and just judgment of those who were non-white Europeans. So that was just ridiculous to me. It was really hard to swallow and simply accept as good writing. And yeah, definitely did not age very well. And I'm a bit nervous, a bit hesitant moving forward, because I do own far more books by Arthur Conan Doyle, but I will be entering those with a far more appropriate expectation level, which will be very low. The 5th book that I will be discussing is It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. This was another newer release, actually. It came out in 2021, and I'm sure everyone under the sun has heard of this book, has seen the cover, and so I definitely was one of those people who was suckered into buying it because I wanted to try more romance this year, and I thought, why not listen to the masses and get this book? And while it was certainly super fun, it was super spicy for those who enjoy that type of romance tropes or romance elements, but I ended up being really disappointed by it because I entered with such high expectations, and partially thanks to Instagram and other social media platforms for making me think this was going to be the best thing since sliced bread. But I think I was also disappointed because I was super excited that it was inspired by Schitt's Creek, but very loosely. I cannot emphasize that enough, how loosely that this novel relates to Schitt's Creek at all. And so that was a huge bummer for me. I also am still trying to get to know the romance tropes that I like and those that I don't. I really don't like miscommunication tropes. I think that it's like the worst. I think it's the worst trope to ever exist. I also don't really like how dramatic certain romances can be when it comes to like realistic conversations. I remember in particular, there's this one moment where the main character Piper, when she's shipped off to, you know, this small town in the Northwest, her mother, you know, gives her some sage advice, and it's like the scene that's supposed to be so dramatic, and her mom says, beware of those fishermen, you know, they're gonna get you, they're gonna make you fall in love with them. And it just seemed so out of the blue that I was like, this very spoiled 20-something, you know, debutante girl, she doesn't even know how to go grocery shopping. She's probably never even balanced a checkbook before. Can you please focus on those types of survival skills before you talk about random romances with fishermen? I couldn't with it. I couldn't. So I ended up giving that book 2 stars. I am realizing there's quite a few romances on this list. I think that in itself shows that I am still figuring out which romances I like. But anyway, here it goes. So number 6 is A Line in the Sand by Terry Wilson. This book came out in 2022, and the reason why I jumped on this, and I listened to it as an audiobook through Hoopla, was because I really did have a lot of fun with the first book in this particular romance series, which was A Spot of Trouble by Terry Wilson. I thought it was really cute, and I really wanted to return to that particular setting, and so I had high hopes going into it. And this was actually the 76th book I read in September, so we are reaching the latter half of the year. And it just ended up being a flop for me, mainly because, again, miscommunication tropes. I'm realizing I really do hate that. And just the lack of understanding, I don't know, it's hard to explain. When these characters are in their 20s, I'm in my 20s, I have an expectation of certain levels of maturity and recognition of how the world works. And there are moments in particular with the main heroine, and I can't remember her name. Nope, it's not going to come to me. But she is in her 20s. She went to college. She moved away, went to college. She was in the real world for a few years and then comes back to this small town. So you'd expect her to just be more aware of how certain things work. Like, for instance, patenting and getting grants from people. Like, she applies for this grant and then, I mean, spoiler, they don't get it. And she's just absolutely devastated, as if it should have been a guarantee, when it's like, grants are competitive. They're very hard. Your organization is not going to be the only organization that is going to be hopefully getting this money. So it just didn't seem really realistic. And then on top of that, there was a certain reveal toward the end of the book that showed that pretty much all of the conflicts that were going on throughout could have been solved immediately, knowing this small bit of information, which just was ridiculous to me. So that was extremely disappointing, and I also gave that 2 stars. I also ended up being disappointed by The Roman Hat Mystery. This was by Ellery Queen. It was the first book that this author duo ended up writing, and I was really looking forward to it because Ellery Queen is known as probably one of the most prolific and well-known American detective fiction writers in the 20th century, and so I really wanted to try out the various stories that exist, and so this was my first experience. And again, it was quite well written. I really enjoyed the duo. It was a detective duo between father and son. However, the reveal and the ending were dependent on certain racist viewpoints that totally existed. I actually think this is far more realistic than obviously The Sign of the Four was, but it was just disappointing with how casual it was discussed, this reveal, when it comes to race being a factor, that I just left a poor taste in my mouth. So I ended up having to give that one 2 stars too. I don't really have much else to say about that one. Next is Tied Up in Tinsel by Niall Marsh. I think that I do blame myself partially for this high expectations, because Niall Marsh is one of the queens of crime when it comes to Golden Age detective fiction. She's right up there with Agatha Christie, Marjorie Allingham, who else? Josephine Tey is often with them, Dorothy L. Sayers. And so I had read one short story by Niall Marsh before. It was in Murder by the Book, which is an anthology, thanks to the British Library Crime Classics editions. love it, highly recommend that collection. But I ended up having really high expectations for Niall Marsh because of that, and just because she's a queen of crime. So reading this for the She Done It book club, it was a December book club pick. I read it in November for research purposes. So I was a bit disappointed with it, mainly because, again, high expectations for who the author was, and it also just felt very slow paced. I am totally fine with, having a murder happen halfway through the book, during the latter half of the book. That is crazy, and that's amazing when authors can really pull that off. But it just felt like there was no emotional investment being gained from these characters. I didn't like any of them. I wasn't really invested in the various issues that were going on. And when the murder finally happened, then it started to slowly pick up the pace. But overall, it just seemed a little outdated. And it was possibly an indicator of an author who was kind of past her prime. It was published, I believe, in the 70s. So this was very late in her career. She'd been, writing for decades at that point, maybe 40, 50 years. So by the time this book came out, I just think that maybe she probably could have put her pen down earlier. With that said, I 100% will be trying more Niall Marsh. I have been recommended Artists in Crime, and that actually is one that I keep seeing. I keep seeing it in my research. So yeah, I will definitely be going back to her earlier works to read it, because I did really like what I had read, excluding Tied Up in Tinsel. That one I was very disappointed with, so I ended up having to give that one 2 stars. And finally, book number 9 that I was disappointed with was actually a very recent read. It was read just this month in December. It was my 93rd book read, and that book was Hook, Line, and Sinker by Tessa Bailey. That just came out in 2022. I know it sounds ridiculous and crazy that I have 2 Tessa Bailey books on here for disappointment. Because the first one disappointed me, I should have been having appropriate expectations for book 2. Why am I disappointed? Well, because book 1 set me up for a very different reading experience for book 2. One of the reasons that I'm now remembering that I also was disappointed by It Happened One Summer is because I was more invested in Hannah and Fox, who were the secondary characters that became the lead characters for book 2. So because I was already more invested in them from their brief experiences with each other compared to Piper and Brendan, the main characters, I was excited for book number 2. Also, most people told me that those who didn't really like book 1 tend to really like book 2, and vice versa. So if you loved book 1, you probably won't like book 2. So I was like, oh my gosh, I'm probably gonna love book 2. And then when I was reading book 2, I suppose there were a few reasons why I was disappointed with it. One was the fact that I had a different voice in mind, thanks to book 1, for our main heroine, Hannah. I thought that she was going to be the kind of chill, aloof girl who is self-confident, focused on her own career, focused on herself, and not nearly as emotionally affected by certain embarrassments or awkwardness. She just was far more chill than her sister, Piper. So when book 2 started, she had pretty much a very similar voice to Piper, beyond the fact that she just wasn't nearly as spoiled, I suppose, or influenced by her high affluent lifestyle. Everything else was very much the same. She was very quirky and bubbly and just so over the top warm that I just had a completely different voice expectation in book 1. So I was really disappointed that she was pretty much just a replica of Piper, who was less self-centered in regards to her wealth. So that was okay, what is the point of me reading this? And then on top of that, So Fox is pretty much a himbo. He's also known as a fuckboy pretty much, who is just, woe is me, I'm just so hot that no girl can ever take me seriously. She'll never want to marry me or be with me forever because all she sees is a pretty face, which is to an extent, I get it. I kind of can see that being a unique spin on certain romantic entanglements, but it was driven so hard down our throats, this idea of him just being so emotionally damaged by the fact that no woman can take him seriously. It's okay, I don't know. I couldn't really understand it. The amount of hot couples that exist, both famously and just around, like, this doesn't make sense. Hot people find each other and they get married. Like, that's just what it, like, that's why I was like, this doesn't really make sense. So to an extent, it was okay, but then it just was so dramatic and so over the top that I couldn't get it. On top of the fact that Hannah wasn't the character that I entered the book hoping for. So yeah, overall, I was disappointed with that. And I did end up giving it 3 stars because I did like it better than It Happened One Summer. But again, I had different expectations, hoping that I would be giving it a 4 or 5 star rating. Okay, so those are my 9 books that I've read that I did find disappointing in 2022. I will say that there are more stats that, again, I probably find more interesting than you do, but let's see. I had them prepared. So what's interesting is that I actually only physically owned 4 out of these 5 books. 2 of them I still have. The other 2 I either have already given away or plan to. The final revival of Opal and Nev was, again, a secondhand book that I ended up buying in December 2021. And what was interesting was it was an ex-library book, which I just don't fully understand because clearly it came out in 2021. So the fact that a library was already weeding it out didn't really make sense to me. But because it was a math read for me, I ended up putting it in the free shelf at the secondhand bookstore in Rochester that I typically frequent. And I was like, go ahead, someone can just take this for free. Good for them if they love it. And then the other book that I bought but now will be giving away is It Happened One Summer. I'm sending it to a friend who I think would enjoy it along with another book. I've been meaning to send it to her for months and I just haven't yet. So if you're watching this, it is on the way soon, hopefully. So the other 2 books that I still own but will just be keeping are Headed for a Hearse and A Study in Scarlet plus The Sign of the Four, mainly because part of my job and my studies as a graduate student involve Golden Age detective fiction. It doesn't make sense for me to give those away, especially if I end up having to need them later on for research purposes. For Headed for a Hearse, it's also a very nice Penzler Classics edition, and because I'm kind of starting to collect them, I would like to keep that anyway. So those 2 books I've just ended up keeping, even though they're by like long dead white men who are both racist. When I say it out loud, it doesn't make sense, but mainly I'm just keeping them because part of my job is researching Golden Age detective fiction, so I have to. So that means that 5 of the books that I read were books I didn't even own, which I am so excited about because most of them were library books or a Netgalley ARC, The Woman in the Library. So it proves that the system works. Reading books from the library benefits everyone, including yourself. I was able to support my local library and its various digital systems. I ended up supporting the author because that means their book is going to be continued to be read. It like will not be weeded out in the system anytime soon because someone recently took it out. And on top of that, I supported myself because while I was not necessarily regretting reading it, I was glad that I didn't buy it because each of these books new would have been $15, $25. So I just saved myself that. So I'm very, very much pleased with that. And yeah, it's really exciting. I will say what's interesting is that I think 5 of the books that I read were also audiobooks. When it came to It Happened One Summer, I did own the physical copy, but I ended up listening to it on Libby. And so some may say, oh, but you know, maybe the fact that they were audiobooks affected your rating experience. Maybe that's why you were disappointed with them, because again, most of the books that I found disappointing were audiobooks. But I did take the time to think about that, and there are so many books this year that I listened to on audiobook that I gave 5 stars. A few of them include Dark Whispers, In Every Generation, multiple Craig Rice books. I listened to quite a few books that ended up getting 5 stars, both books that I've read in the By the Book series. So yeah, I don't think that that is actually a really valid reason for why I may have been disappointed with some of these reads. And I had no issues with any of the voice actors, to be honest. I think that they all did a great job for what they could do for this particular book for my pleasure. So yeah, just really fascinating to always take the time to reflect on your reading experiences. I'm hoping that soon I'll be discussing my favorite books of 2022, my top reading books, but I want to finish the book that I'm reading right now before I start making those rankings. And yeah, maybe in that video I'll really break down the various books that I read across the year when it came to different genres, which genre did I read the most, we know it's going to be mysteries, but anyway. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to just reflecting on my reads, making new reading goals too, and I don't know, make some changes so that I'm less disappointed. Maybe the goal will be to have less than 9 books that disappoint me next year. I don't know, but to be honest, that's about 10%. 10% of the books that I've read this year have been disappointing. I think that's a pretty good number. What do you think? Anyway, thank you everyone who got to the end of the video. If you really enjoyed it, consider giving it a like, consider subscribing, commenting, ringing the little bell so that you're one of the first people notified when another video like this pops up. And yeah, I hope that you had a really fascinating reading year as well. And yeah, I would just like to hear from you. Thanks everybody. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.